Okay, so let's get into this. We are doing a deep dive today on a word that is, it's so common, so completely foundational to modern life.
It really is.
You probably use it, or you at least think about it, every single month. It's just a simple four-letter word, but it governs these massive, massive sectors of the global economy.
Yeah.
We're talking about rent.
And you're so right to call it foundational. But what we found, and this was really fascinating, when we looked at our source for this, which is just a deceptively simple disambiguation page for the term rent, is that this word is, it's an economic chameleon.
A chameleon, I like
It
that.
really is. It has multiple fiercely independent personalities. It operates, all at the same time as the bedrock of your housing contract,
Right, the one we all know.
but also as a sophisticated and often really critical concept in high-level economic theory. And then you have a defining cultural landmark in theater and film, and even a really specific piece of retro gaming terminology. It's just all over the map.
That scope is just wild, isn't it? Most terms that carry this much intellectual and cultural weight, they have dozens of variations or different phrasings. But here we have this one single word doing what triple or quadruple duty. It's incredible.
It really is.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We want to give you a really rapid but also thorough insight into the many faces of rent. The goal is that whether you hear this term, in a financial report talking about market inefficiencies, or you see it referenced in an article about a Broadway classic,
Yeah.
you'll instantly know which context applies, and this is the crucial part, why it matters.
Absolutely. And the structure of our source list, it's our roadmap. But it also creates this fascinating challenge for us because it forces us to constantly jump between and contrast these really disparate definitions.
We can't just follow a single story.
Exactly. There's no narrative here. We have to focus on the semantic separation, the vast gulf between, say, economic rent and the musical rent. It's a fun challenge.
Okay, so we have a clear path forward then. We're going to start with the definition everyone gets, the universally understood one, the temporary payment for temporary use,
The foundation.
the foundation. Then we're going to jump into the deep end, into the surprising and often contentious nuances of academic economics. This is where the word becomes, a really powerful tool for critique.
And that's where it gets really juicy.
It does. And finally, we'll pivot completely over to the massive cultural and entertainment impact of this single title. So let's ground ourselves first. Let's start with the definition that pretty much everyone recognizes, the one that governs billions of transactions every single day all around the world. What is that simple foundational concept of renting?
Okay, so the source starts with the absolute core. It defines renting as an agreement where a payment is made for the temporary use of a good, service, or property.
Temporary use, those are the key words.
Those are the key words. It's the agreement that really underpins our entire modern society's relationship with assets we don't own ourselves.
And the universality of it is just staggering when you stop to think about it. It obviously spans physical property, apartments, office buildings, that kind of thing. But it also covers huge industrial sectors, like equipment leasing. Think about airlines renting aircraft engines from each other, or construction companies leasing heavy machinery for a specific job.
Right, because they don't want the capital costs of owning a multi-million-dollar crane they only need for 6 months.
Exactly. And even in the digital world, we rent cloud computing power from Amazon or Google by the minute, by the second even. The common thread is always that stress on temporary use versus outright ownership.
That's the core distinction.
You're paying for access and for utility,
Yeah.
but you are not acquiring equity. You're not taking on the liability for the asset's long-term depreciation or its eventual breakdown.
And from an economic standpoint, the decision to rent versus buy, it's a really complex calculation. It's driven by, I'd say, 3 main factors: liquidity, flexibility, and risk.
So break that down.
Well, for the lessee, that's the person or company doing the renting, it frees up capital, money that would otherwise be completely tied up in purchasing the asset.
So you can use that cash for other things, like growing the business.
Precisely. It also offers incredible flexibility to scale up or down very quickly. A business that's growing fast can just rent more office space instead of being stuck in a building that's suddenly too small.
Or too big if things go the other way.
Or too big, exactly. And crucially, it transfers the burden of risk. The risk of obsolescence. What if a new, better model comes out? The risk of maintenance, of a sudden breakdown. All of that risk is transferred to the lessor, the property owner.
So that rent payment I'm making, it's actually compensating the owner for a bunch of different things. It's for the use of their capital, the administrative costs of managing the whole thing, and for them, taking on all of those risks we just mentioned. Is that right?
That's exactly right. The payment is covering the depreciation of the asset, the interest on the capital they invested to buy it in the first place, and of course a profit margin. It's a very clean, very intuitive transaction.
It is. But as you hinted at earlier, once economists started, digging into how markets really work, they realized this concept of rent could be applied far, far beyond a simple lease agreement.
And that's where the term takes a very sharp, very intellectual turn.
This transition takes us directly to the concept that is absolutely central to serious economic analysis, but is, completely different from your monthly housing bill.
Yes. Here we move to the highly technical, classical definition. Economic rent. And this is defined not as a payment for property, but as any payment in excess of the cost of production.
Okay, wait. Let's really drill down on that.
Yes.
Because that right there, that's the aha moment for anyone listening. Suddenly the word rent is completely detached from housing.
Completely.
And it's attached firmly to this idea of surplus value.
Precisely. And to really get your head around its modern usage, you have to look at its history. The concept was first formalized by classical economists, most notably David Ricardo, way back in the early 19th century.
And he wasn't looking at apartments in London, was he?
No, not at all. He was specifically looking at agricultural land. The question that was bugging him and his contemporaries was, why does a really fertile piece of land command a much higher price than a rocky, marginal piece of land?
Well, because it produces more yield, right? More corn or wheat for the same amount of effort, so it creates a greater profit.
You've nailed it. That's exactly what Ricardo realized. He saw that the market price of corn was ultimately set by the cost of production on the least fertile land that was needed to meet the public's demand.
Okay, so the worst piece of land that's still being farmed sets the price for everyone.
Yes. So any piece of land that was more fertile than that marginal plot would naturally generate a surplus profit. And this is the key, that surplus was not due to the landlord's extra labor or investment. It was due to the inherent, unchangeable scarcity and quality of the land itself.
It's a gift of nature, basically.
A gift of nature. And that surplus, that differential benefit, he termed rent.
So the original economic rent was tied absolutely to natural, scarcity, unique, productive land that you can't just create more of.
Yes, and that is the critical kernel of the concept that has survived for 200 years. It is the return an input receives above what is necessary to keep that input in its current use. Economists later generalized this idea beyond land to include any factor of production that is unique or scarce in some way.
Okay, so give us an example of how that applies outside of agriculture. What about, say, labor or unique talent?
A superstar professional athlete is the classic modern example. Let's take a world-class soccer player. They might earn millions and millions of dollars a year.
Tens of millions, yeah.
Now, what is the absolute minimum amount of money you would have to pay that individual to keep them playing soccer instead of, say, becoming a mid-level office manager? Let's assume that minimum required salary, what economists call their opportunity cost or their cost of production, let's say it's maybe $100,000 a year.
Okay, so the difference between that $100,000 minimum they need to keep playing and the, say, $20 million they actually earn, that difference is astronomical.
That difference, the $19.9 million surplus, is their economic rent. It is a return on a scarce, unique factor of production, which is their incredible talent that is far, far in excess of the payment needed to keep them in the market.
And it only exists because the demand for their unique service scoring goals, winning championships, so far outstrips the supply of other people who are equally talented.
You've got it. There's only one of them. That scarcity allows them to capture that massive surplus.
So if I'm a manufacturer of a highly standardized commodity like, I don't know, a basic screw, and I'm operating in a perfectly competitive market, my price will be driven down by competition to be exactly my cost of production, plus maybe a tiny profit.
Right.
So I would earn basically zero economic rent.
Essentially zero, yes.
But if I develop a groundbreaking new drug and I get a 20-year patent from the government, which creates an artificial legal scarcity, the super profits I make during that 20-year period, profits way above my actual costs of manufacturing, that is economic rent.
That is a perfect distillation of the concept. This shows you that whenever you see sustained above-average profits in any market, whether they're derived from a unique location like a storefront on Fifth Avenue, a scarce natural resource like a diamond mine, or a legal monopoly like a patent, you are observing economic rent at work.
So its existence is basically a sign of market power or unique assets or, and this is critical, market imperfections.
It is. And it's not necessarily bad in and of itself that athletes' talent is a real thing, but it's a powerful indicator of some kind of structural advantage.
That just makes the term rent so intellectually dense. It's not just a payment. It's a measure of surplus generated by a privileged position, which is completely divorced from the common usage of renting an apartment.
And once you understand that concept, that surplus is based on scarcity, the entire intellectual framework is set up for critique.
How so?
Because the next logical question is, what do people do to get that surplus? And that leads us directly to the next, and often very controversial, application of the term.
Right. So we're moving beyond the simple existence of the surplus itself, and we're getting to the actions people take to acquire it. And this is where the term, as you said, it takes on this inherently critical, often negative connotation, especially in economic policy discussions. We're talking about rent seeking.
That's right. Rent seeking is defined in our source material as attempting to increase one's share of existing wealth without creating new wealth. This concept is so crucial because it marks a clear, bright line separating activities that actually grow the economy.
Like innovation, production, genuine investment.
All of that, from activities that merely redistribute the wealth that's already been created.
I always think of it as using your resources to kind of game the system rather than using your resources to build up the system. You're lobbying politicians to get a bigger slice of the existing pie instead of using your time and money to bake a bigger pie for everyone.
That analogy holds up extremely well. The mechanisms for rent-seeking typically involve engaging the political or regulatory process. Think about a major corporation that spends millions on lobbying the government to pass a law that gives them a specific subsidy.
Or even better, a law that forces all these crazy regulatory hurdles on any new competitors, making it prohibitively expensive for a startup to even enter the market.
That's a classic example. So if Company A spends, say, $5 million on lobbying Congress to secure a $50 million exclusive government contract that guarantees them a monopoly profit.
Okay.
That $5 million is the cost of the rent-seeking activity, and the resulting $50 million profit is the economic rent they successfully captured.
Right. And the key characteristic here, the thing that makes economists so critical of this, is that the effort and resources, that $5 million in your example, it wasn't used to produce a better good or a more efficient service or a new technology.
Not at all. Those resources were essentially just consumed, burned up in a zero-sum or even a negative-sum transfer game. This leads to a really important concept we should touch on, something economists call deadweight loss.
Okay, yes, we need to make sure you, the listener, really grasp deadweight loss because it's a sophisticated concept, but it's hidden behind some pretty dry academic jargon. What does that term really mean in this context?
So deadweight loss, in simple terms, refers to the loss of economic efficiency that happens when the ideal equilibrium for a good or service isn't achieved. In the case of rent-seeking, the loss comes directly from those wasted resources.
The $5 million spent on lobbying.
Exactly. The money, the time, the human capital, all the smart lawyers, lobbyists, compliance officers, all of that is diverted away from productive, wealth-creating activities, things like R&D, manufacturing, customer service, or genuine innovation.
So if a company's brightest engineers are spending all their time designing, I don't know, legal strategies to get a patent extended for another 10 years instead of designing a brand new product,
Yes.
then society as a whole suffers that deadweight loss because a potentially useful, life-saving, or just cool invention never even materialized.
That's the tragedy of it. It's a resource drain that benefits only the rent seeker, and it comes at the expense of overall economic efficiency and progress. The pie doesn't grow. It might even shrink a little because of the waste.
It creates these enormous societal inefficiencies, doesn't it?
Huge ones.
Yeah.
I mean, consider something like occupational licensing. If a state government imposes unnecessarily strict and time-consuming licensing requirements for a profession, let's say, interior design or hair braiding, which are common examples,
Right.
it effectively creates an artificial barrier to entry. The existing practitioners, the people already in the profession, they might lobby for these strict rules, and they'll say it's to protect the public, to ensure quality.
Which is always the stated goal, of course.
It's always the public-facing reason. But the real economic reason is often to protect themselves from new competition. It keeps supply low, allowing them to capture economic rent through that artificial scarcity. That lobbying activity is rent-seeking.
So it's a really sharp critique of how markets function in the real world, versus how they're supposed to function in a perfect textbook theory. Understanding that distinction, between profits from a genuinely better product and profits from favorable regulations, that's just crucial for being able to evaluate public policy.
It truly is. It moves the entire discussion of market failure from abstract theory into observable political reality. It shows that some of the most damaging monopolies might not arise from being the best, but from capturing the regulatory state.
And just when we are really deep in this discussion of institutional economics and wealth extraction,
Yeah, we're way in the weeds here.
we are. And the source material just forces this sudden and pretty significant shift in tone.
An abrupt one, yeah.
This is where we see that untamed semantic range of the word rent just hit us out of nowhere. The very next item listed under the economics section is rent boy or rent boy.
And it's defined simply as a male prostitute.
Right. And that inclusion, it just demonstrates the sheer breadth of concepts that can fall under the banner of rent when you're analyzing things through a purely transactional lens.
Absolutely. The source material, because it's a neutral disambiguation page, it's just categorizing.
Yeah.
And it's categorizing based on the fundamental exchange of a payment for a service.
So we transition from this high-level institutional extraction, the CEO in a suit lobbying for a tariff, down to this highly localized individual transactional payment for a service. It's, in a way, the rawest form of payment for temporary access.
And we simply note the categorical placement here. We're not editorializing, just observing that it underscores how the core meaning, a defined payment for temporary use or access to some factor, is so fundamentally powerful that it applies across, well, every conceivable strata of human interaction.
From real estate to labor.
From intellectual property to very specific personal services. This vastness of definition is what makes the word so complex and often so fraught with different meanings in different contexts.
It is a stark and I think a necessary reminder that language is often just pragmatic. It groups concepts based on their common function, in this case the transaction, rather than their moral or social implications.
Well said.
Okay, now let's pivot entirely. Let's leave the financial and theoretical sphere behind and jump into the high-impact world of culture and entertainment. So our journey now takes us from, the invisible forces of the market to the bright lights of Broadway. This section is all about the biggest cultural touchstone associated with the word, the iconic musical Rent.
Musical Rent, yes. Created by the brilliant and just so tragically short-lived Jonathan Larson, it's a towering cultural phenomenon. I mean, it's hard to overstate its impact, especially in the 1990s and beyond.
It's not an overstatement at all.
It took this simple, financial, almost mundane word rent, and it just infused it with this incredible emotional weight with themes of mortality, love, and powerful social commentary.
The absolute genius of the show, I think, is how that basic struggle to pay the rent became a perfect metaphor for the much larger struggle to simply exist.
Yep.
Particularly for artists, for queer individuals, and for those living with HIV/AIDS in that really precarious environment of New York City's East Village in the late 80s and early 90s. The show's core message is all about living intensely in the face of a temporary existence.
And that link back to the foundational definition of rent temporary access is so critical. These characters, they're often squatting or dealing with the constant threat of eviction. They are literally living a temporary, precarious life.
Always on the edge.
Always. Constantly negotiating the terms of their existence, whether it's their housing, their health, or their community. The very title reflects their profound lack of permanence or security. It's brilliant.
It was a massive, massive hit. And the source material details the enduring legacy of this single-stage production by listing two distinct cinematic treatments of it.
Right. We start with Rent film, which is the 2005 movie version of the musical. This was the traditional Hollywood adaptation. They took the energy, the music, the story from the stage and translated it directly onto the screen with many of the original Broadway cast members, which was great to see.
It was. But then, just 3 years later, we have a separate and distinct entry in our source, Rent, filmed live on Broadway. And this is the 2008 film that documents the final Broadway performance.
And this separation is really instructive, I think, because it highlights two different forms of cultural preservation. The 2005 film was all about interpretation, adapting the material for a new medium, a new audience.
Using close-ups, different locations, all the tools of cinema.
Exactly. But the 2008 film was about archival capture. It was about documenting that specific ephemeral live performance, the real set, the actual audience reaction, the raw energy, the atmosphere of that final curtain call.
Which is a completely different experience.
Yeah, a totally different goal. It shows that the cultural importance of the title was so high that both the adaptation and the historical documentation were seen as necessary cultural products. The story had to be both retold and preserved in its original form.
So what this all means is that for an entire generation, and probably more, the word rent has become shorthand for this whole world of bohemian struggle, of community bonds, of the emotional cost of just existing in a high-cost urban environment.
Which is a world away from the economic concept of surplus value we were just discussing.
A million miles away. And then moving beyond the musical itself, the word rent filters into the specialized jargon of the very industries that produce our culture, specifically the film business.
And this brings us back, subtly, to a financial definition, but a very specific one for the entertainment world. Gross rentals, which is also known as distributor rentals.
Now, this sounds confusing because it's clearly not about me renting a movie at home from a streaming service. This is a term specific to theatrical box office revenue. What's the definition here?
It's defined as the distributor's share of a film's theatrical revenue at the box office. So to understand this, you have to picture the revenue chain.
Yeah.
The number you always hear about, the gross box office, that's the total amount of money collected from all the ticket sales.
The big number. The movie made $100 million its opening weekend.
That's the one. But the first cut of that money, and it's often a substantial one, goes to the cinema owner, the exhibitor. What's left, which can be, around 50%, sometimes a bit more or less, is the money that's paid to the film's distributor.
The studio, like Disney or Warner Brothers.
Usually, yes. And that payment is for the temporary right to screen their film in the theater. That specific payment to the distributor is the rental.
So it actually ties back beautifully to our foundational economic concept of temporary use. The theater is, in essence, renting the intellectual property of the film for a limited run.
For a few weeks, yes.
And the payment for that temporary license is the distributor's rental revenue. It's the cost of licensing IP for public exhibition.
You've got it perfectly. It's the number that defines the ultimate profitability of a film from the producer's perspective. So when a studio executive says a film earned $200 million, they might be talking about the gross box office to the press. But when they're calculating their own profit and loss,
they're looking at the much smaller gross rentals number.
That's the number they really care about. And understanding this term, it really separates the informed observer of the film industry from someone who just looks at the total revenue number in the headlines.
And then we pivot again. From Hollywood distribution to a genuine deep cut into digital history, linking the word rent to some very niche subcultures. The source lists rent. MUD.
Yes.
Defined as a game mechanic in some MUDs, which stands for multi-user dungeons.
This is a fantastic example of the word stickiness. I love this one. For anyone who might not be familiar, MUDs were these text-based multiplayer online games from the late 80s and 90s. They are the direct ancestors of modern games like World of Warcraft.
So there's no graphics, just text descriptions of rooms, monsters, and actions.
Exactly. It was all imagination. And they were often a harsh, persistent digital world. Your character existed even when you were logged off.
So why on earth would an elf warrior have to pay rent in a fantasy realm? I mean, did the source give any indication of why the game designers used that specific language? They could have called it a decay tax or an upkeep fee or something.
The source doesn't give the designer's original intent, no, but the choice of the word rent is logically so powerful. In these early digital worlds, every character you created, every sword or piece of armor you own, every personalized digital space, it all consumed real server resources, real storage space, real memory.
And servers were expensive back then.
Incredibly expensive. So many MUDs instituted rent as a cost sink, usually paid in in-game currency, to maintain the persistence of your character and your inventory while you were logged off.
So it literally became a payment for temporary access to server memory.
That's what it was.
So if you fail to pay your rent, your character data might be wiped, or your stored items would just decay and disappear. It simulated eviction or abandonment.
It is the perfect digital mirror of the foundational definition. You are paying for the continued temporary use of a piece of digital property or for persistent access to the server state. It also enforced activity. It made you log in and play. You had to go out, slay a dragon, get some gold just to pay your rent, or you'd lose your investment.
That's fascinating. The foundational economic logic of temporary costs applies perfectly, even to completely invented fantasy economies.
It's a universal logic.
And finally, just to show how pervasive the word is across all of culture, we have a quick look at its direct use in song titles, demonstrating its resonance across different eras of pop music.
We have two key examples listed in the source. First, the iconic Rent song, the 1987 pop music hit from the Pet Shop Boys.
A classic.
An absolute classic. And that song is just a brilliant piece of social commentary. It uses the concept of paying rent to frame this transactional, dependent relationship where one person is relying financially on the other. It's a really sharp exploration of the power dynamics that are inherent in the financial vulnerability of the common definition of rent. I love you, you pay my rent. It's very direct.
Very direct. And second, we have a more contemporary example. Rent, Song, a song by the artist Lights from her album Pep. The inclusion of these two different titles just shows that decades apart, the word remains powerful, it's emotionally charged, it's durable, and it's adaptable enough to serve as a strong lyrical focal point for discussions about cost, value, and relationships.
Okay, so we have navigated through an incredible semantic maze here. I mean, we've covered classical Ricardian economics, critical policy analysis of rent seeking, the emotional weight of a generation-defining Broadway musical, and even the esoteric mechanics of retro online gaming. We really need to tie this complex spectrum together now.
And the profound synthesis, I think, lies in recognizing how that core unifying principle persists, no matter how distant the application seems on the surface. We saw that economic rent is that surplus wealth generated by scarcity.
Right.
And rent seeking is the active extraction of existing wealth. And then on the other side, we saw the musical rent, which is all about the human struggle against a temporary, precarious existence. And what's so fascinating as we look back on all of this is how that core idea of payment for temporary access or a privileged position ties all of these disparate definitions together. It really is the hidden thread, isn't it?
It is. I mean, just think about it for a second. Let's line them up.
Property rent. That's a payment for temporary access to a physical structure or a privileged location.
Yeah.
Simple enough.
Okay.
2, economic rent, say, from patents or scarcity.
Okay.
That's the payment you receive for having a privileged, unique market position that yields excess profit.
It's the benefit of the position itself.
Exactly. 3, rent seeking. That's the investment, often a political one, that you make to acquire or maintain a privileged position for financial access or control.
So it's the active pursuit of that position?
It is. 4,
Yeah.
gross rentals in the film industry. That's the payment for temporary access to an intellectual asset, the film. And 5, MUD rent. Payment for temporary persistence in a privileged digital state on a server. Every single one is about conditional access.
So the term rent, at its deepest level, it fundamentally implies a transactional relationship where something valuable is accessed or maintained, but it's never fully owned or made universally available. It is always, always about a conditional arrangement.
That's a great way to summarize it.
It's the difference between buying the car and leasing it, or the difference between building a monopoly through true innovation versus building it through political influence. The use of that common word, rent, highlights the conditional, temporary nature of the transaction.
It does.
And that makes the word incredibly powerful for analysis, but only if you know exactly which layer of that conditionality you're actually discussing.
And this naturally brings us to the final part of our source, the listed related terms, which really serve as extensions of this whole analysis. These terms show you the legal and financial family tree of the rent concept.
Right, so we have 4 terms listed here for further exploration. Rental disambiguation, rentier disambiguation, lease disambiguation, and let disambiguation. For anyone listening who wants to be truly, thoroughly well-informed, these secondary terms kind of complete the picture.
They do. And lease and let are the most straightforward. They're the legal and linguistic extensions of that foundational definition of renting we started with.
So a lease is the contract.
A lease is the formal, typically long-term contract that governs the terms of the rent. It formalizes the temporary nature of the agreement, puts it down on paper. And let is simply the common British English phrasing for offering property for rent flat to let.
So that just shows a linguistic divergence in how the concept is applied.
Exactly. Those terms are all about the legal architecture that's built around the basic transaction.
But the most powerful related term on this list, the one that connects directly back to our sophisticated economic discussion, is rentier.
Yes. A rentier is defined as a person who lives off unearned income, often specifically from rent payments, investments, or other passive income sources. And this is a very, very charged term in economic and political critique.
So how does that connect back to rent seeking? It sounds like someone who benefits from economic rent, but maybe without having to engage in the active and often negative process of rent seeking themselves.
That is the key distinction. A rentier benefits passively from simply owning an asset that generates scarcity-based income. Think of a large traditional landowner from the 19th century, or someone today who owns a vast portfolio of patents or copyrights.
They're collecting the checks.
They're collecting the checks. Rent-seeking, on the other hand, is the active endeavor to create or expand those conditions of scarcity. It's the lobbying for laws, the capturing of regulators. So the rentier is the beneficiary of the economic system as it exists, while the rent-seeker is the activist trying to skew that system even more in their favor.
This completes the entire loop, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It takes us from the simple, shared cost of renting a home all the way to the most critical analyses of how wealth is accumulated and distributed in global markets.
It really does.
It's a lens to see the difference between those who create value and those who simply own privileged access to value.
And it shows that the deeper you dig into this one simple word, rent, the more you understand about how structural power and scarcity really determine who benefits and who pays the cost of access in our world.
So we started this deep dive with a single common word, and that disambiguation page became a blueprint for understanding its completely divergent paths. We've mastered the distinction between paying your monthly housing rent and analyzing economic rent, that pure surplus derived from scarcity. We've also seen how that surplus can be actively pursued through rent-seeking activities, which can drain an economy's vitality.
And the key takeaway for you listening is all about recognizing context. Rent is a linguistic chameleon. So never assume it means property payment when you're reading an economic paper on public policy. And obviously, never assume it refers to economic surplus when you're discussing the cultural legacy of Jonathan Larson.
Mastery really comes from instantly identifying which type of access, which type of transaction, or which type of critique is being discussed at that moment.
Absolutely.
And so we are left with a final provocative thought, one that forces us to apply these complex economic critiques to the very products that define our culture. We establish that economic rent is surplus value, and rent seeking is a form of wealth extraction.
Right.
And we then looked at gross rentals, which is the massive distributor's share of theatrical revenue from a movie like the movie version of Rent.
Yes. The distributor takes a significant percentage for the service of getting that film to market. And this raises, I think, an important question for you to mull over.
What's the question?
Does that distributor's rental fee represent genuine wealth creation? Is it an essential, efficient service that maximizes the film's earnings for everyone, the artist included? Or, if that distribution pipeline is highly consolidated, if there are only a few major players, and the fees are disproportionately high simply because they possess privileged, near-monopolistic access to theaters worldwide,
Then what?
then does that large share start behaving less like a payment for a service and more like a form of rent-seeking?
It forces you to look at the business of art, the creation of wealth through culture, and apply the hard logic of economic critique to see if the value is being genuinely created or if it's just being extracted because of a privileged position in the marketplace.
It shows that this analysis of access and surplus is universal. It applies everywhere. Something for you to chew on until our next deep dive.